The war began before anyone could prepare. Across the stars, two great empires collided, shaking entire systems with fire and steel. The alien kingdom of Zira had long stood as one of the most feared powers in the galaxy. Their armies were vast, their fleets endless, and their rulers ruthless. For centuries they had crushed resistance, bent worlds to their will, and taken what they desired. But then came the humans. No one had expected the small, young species from Earth to stand against them. No one had believed they could. At first, the humans were ignored. Their homeworld was considered weak, their people fragile, their technology behind the great empires. But humans had something the Zirans could not measure, a spirit that refused to break. Battles that should have ended in minutes dragged on for weeks. Soldiers that should have surrendered fought to their last breath. And slowly, the humans began to win. Amid this storm of war, the Ziran royal court made a decision. Their youngest, Princess Lira, would be promised to one of their powerful kings as a symbol of unity, a marriage that would tie their clans together and strengthen their rule. She was beautiful, with eyes that burned like starlight and a voice that silenced entire halls. Many saw her as a prize, a jewel to be claimed. But Lira was more than a jewel. Behind her graceful smile lived a mind sharp as a blade, and a heart that longed for freedom. On the day her engagement was announced, the palace was filled with celebration. Lights glowed from towers, songs rose into the skies, and warriors boasted of victories. But Lira stood apart. Her hands were cold, her heart heavy. She listened to the vows spoken in her name and felt chains tightening around her. She knew the king she was promised to was cruel, a man feared even by his allies. Her future would not be one of love, but of power and control. And then came the unexpected. The humans had launched a desperate raid into Ziran space, striking deep behind enemy lines. The attack shocked everyone. How could a young race dare such a thing? In the chaos that followed, human ships fell from the skies, their wreckage burning in the distance. Some survivors were captured and brought to the capital as trophies. Among them was a soldier barely older than Lira herself. His armor was damaged, his face bruised, but his eyes held the same fire she had read about in secret reports. When Lira first saw him, she felt something shift inside her. He did not bow. He did not cower before the Ziran lords. Even when beaten, he stood tall, his gaze steady. It was the first time she had ever seen a human up close, and it was nothing like the stories told by her people. They had called humans weak, reckless, doomed. But this one looked straight at the alien court as if he had nothing to fear. That night, Lira could not sleep. The celebrations still rang in her ears, but her mind returned again and again to the human's eyes. She thought of the life chosen for her, a future chained to a man she did not love. She thought of the war that refused to end, of the humans who fought with a courage her own people could not explain. And in her heart, a spark of rebellion grew. The princess who had been promised to a king now dreamed of something else. She dreamed of freedom, and of the human who had stood unbroken before her people. The morning after the raid, the capital city was restless. Smoke still curled in the skies where human wreckage had fallen, and whispers spread across the palace, like fire. The humans had not only survived but had struck at the very heart of Ziran space. For the lords and generals it was an insult that could not be forgiven. For Lira, it was a sign that the war was not as simple as her people believed. She dressed in silence, the weight of her jeweled robe pressing down on her. Servants spoke of victories and the strength of her future husband, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought of the captured human soldier. His eyes had burned with a strange light, different from anything she had seen among her kind. It was not arrogance, nor blind faith. It was something harder, fiercer, and unyielding. Later that day, the captives were brought before the court, again. Shackled and wounded, they were forced to kneel in chains as trophies of the kingdom's might. The lords sneered, mocking their broken bodies, but still the human soldier held his head high. His lips were split, his arm hung weakly, but his spirit refused to bow. Lira's gaze found him, and for a brief moment, Their eyes met. He said nothing, but the silence carried more than words could. When the trial ended, the humans were dragged away to the dungeons beneath the palace. Lira returned to her chambers, yet her heart would not rest. She tried to remind herself of duty, of the promise to the king, but the image of the human standing proud in chains would not leave her. That night, while the palace feasted, she slipped quietly from her chambers. The dungeons were cold, carved from stone older than the empire itself. The guards were half asleep, drunk from celebration, and she passed them unnoticed. Down the long corridor, she found the cell where the human was kept. He sat in the corner, his hands bound, his breathing slow but steady. When he lifted his head, she saw the same fire in his eyes, dimmed but not extinguished. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough, each word heavy with pain. "You should not be alive," she replied softly. For a moment, they stared at each other through the bars. Lira felt the weight of her world pressing down on her shoulders, yet in that moment she also felt something else, a freedom she had never known. Here was a man who had nothing left, no crown, no power, no army, yet he carried himself as if he were greater than all the kings of her people. She whispered, "Why do you fight like this? You must know you cannot win." His answer was simple. "Because giving up is worse than dying." The word struck her like a blade. All her life she had been told her destiny was to serve her people, to obey the will of the crown, to accept the path chosen for her. But here was a human who chose to fight, even when defeat seemed certain. His spirit challenged everything she had been taught. Footsteps echoed from down the hall, and Lira quickly pulled her hood over her head. She turned to leave, but before she did, she whispered one last thing through the bars. "My name is Lira." The human's eyes softened, and though his lips barely moved, she heard him answer, "Evan." She slipped away into the shadows, her heart racing. The palace above roared with victory songs, but deep inside her, a dangerous thought had begun to grow. She was promised to a king, but her soul was moving toward something else, something far more dangerous. That night, Princess Lira lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she questioned not only her future, but the very empire she was meant to serve. And though she tried to push the thought away, she knew the truth. Her heart had already chosen a path that would change everything. The next day dawned with a strange silence over the capital. Victory celebrations had begun to fade, leaving behind the unease of what the humans had dared to do. Soldiers marched through the streets in tight formations. Banners fluttered high above the towers, but in the eyes of the people there was a flicker of something rare: fear. Inside the palace, Lira walked through the marble halls with her head held high, though her thoughts were tangled. She could still hear Evan's voice in her mind, those simple words that carried more weight than any royal decree. Because giving up is worse than dying. She tried to banish them, but they echoed with every step she took. In the throne room, the king she was promised to stood tall before the council. His presence filled the chamber, heavy and suffocating. His armor was gilded, his cloak edged with jewels, and his voice was like thunder as he declared that the humans would be crushed once and for all. He boasted that the war would end within weeks, that resistance would be broken, that the galaxy would remember his name. The lords cheered, but Lyra's stomach twisted. The king's gaze fell on her, sharp and possessive. She lowered her eyes as tradition demanded, but inside her chest a quiet rebellion stirred. She could not imagine a life bound to such a man who saw people as pawns and war as a game. That evening, she returned once more to the dungeons. She told herself it was foolish, dangerous even, but her feet carried her there as if fate itself pulled her forward. Evan was awake this time, sitting against the cold stone wall. When he saw her approach, he stood, though the chains clattered against his wrists. "You came back," he said, his voice steady despite his wounds. "I should not have," she answered, though her tone betrayed her. For a moment neither spoke, then Lira asked the question that had haunted her since the night before. "Why do your people fight so hard? Why not submit as others have?" Evan's eyes locked on hers. Because freedom is worth more than life. We may lose battles. We may even lose worlds, but as long as one of us keeps fighting, we are never truly conquered. Lira felt her chest tighten. No one in her world spoke that way. For her people, survival was obedience. Power was control. Freedom was a word used only in stories, never in life. Yet here it was, alive in front of her, burning in the eyes of a human prisoner. "You speak as though you believe you can defeat an empire," she whispered. He smiled faintly, though pain lingered in his expression. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, yes, because your empire underestimates us. They see weakness where there is will, and will is stronger than any crown." The words shook her. In that cold dungeon, surrounded by chains and shadows, she felt more alive than she ever had in the glittering halls of her palace. She knew it was dangerous to listen, dangerous even to stand so close to him, but she could not walk away. Before she left, Evan leaned forward, his voice low. "You don't belong here, do you?" The question froze her. She wanted to deny it, to claim loyalty, but the truth pressed against her heart. She whispered, "No, I don't." When she returned to her chambers, she found her hand trembling. She pressed it against her chest and felt her heartbeat racing. For the first time in her life, Princess Lira was beginning to understand what it meant to choose, not to obey. And far above the palace walls, the stars burned bright, as if watching, the quiet spark that had begun to grow between a human prisoner and the alien princess who was promised to a king. Days passed, but the image of Evan in the dungeons refused to leave Lyra's thoughts. She had met him only twice, spoken only a handful of words, yet it felt as though he had carved a mark on her soul. His voice echoed when she tried to sleep. His fire burned behind her eyes when she walked through the palace. The contrast between his courage and the emptiness of her own life became unbearable. Her betrothal to the king drew closer with each passing day. Courtiers whispered of the grand ceremony, servants prepared silks and jewels, and the priests spoke of destiny. To everyone around her, the marriage was a triumph for the empire. To Lira, it was a cage slowly closing in. One evening, she was summoned to dine with the king. The hall glittered with gold, and servants carried trays heavy with food. The king spoke of conquest, of breaking the humans once and for all. His words were sharp, his laughter cruel. When he looked at her, it was not with love, but with ownership. She lowered her gaze as tradition demanded, but her heart burned with silent rage. Later that night, she slipped once again to the dungeons. The guards had grown careless, confident in their power, and she moved unseen. When she reached Evan's cell, he was awake, his back against the stone wall, his eyes as sharp as ever. "You risk everything coming here," he told her. "And yet I come," she replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled. For a moment they simply stared at each other through the iron bars. Then she whispered, "I cannot stand the thought of belonging to him. I cannot stand the thought of being chained for the rest of my life." Evan leaned forward, his voice low but certain. "Then you must choose differently." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her that way. In her world, choices were made for her path carved by others. Yet here was a man with nothing, daring to tell her she could decide her own fate. She shook her head. "It is not that simple. My life is not my own. If I resist, my people will suffer. If I defy the king, there will be war within our own ranks." "War has already come," Evan answered. "It is not your silence that will save your people, Lira. It is your courage." His words struck deeper than any blade. She wanted to deny them, to turn away, but her heart rebelled against the lie she had lived all her life. She pressed her hand against the cold bars, closer to him than ever before. For a moment, the space between them felt like nothing. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked softly. Evan's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "Because even in this place I can see you are not free, and no one deserves chains, princess." Her chest tightened and she quickly pulled back, afraid of her own feelings. She turned to leave, her heart racing faster than her steps. But before she disappeared into the shadows, she whispered, "You are not like any man I have ever known." That night when she lay in her chambers, she could still feel the heat of his words against her skin. The palace above her was filled with lights and laughter, but Lira felt as though the walls were closing in. For the first time, she knew she could not walk blindly toward the marriage that awaited her. Something inside her had already shifted, and no force in the galaxy could turn it back. The palace was alive with celebration, but Lira felt only dread. Each day brought her closer to the marriage that would bind her to the king, and no amount of silks or jewels could hide the weight pressing on her chest. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, smiling when expected, bowing when demanded, but inside her heart throbbed with fear and defiance. The humans were kept as prisoners, their presence paraded before the court as proof of Ziran might. Yet every time Lyra's eyes found Evan in chains, something inside her shifted. He was not broken, no matter how cruelly he was treated. His spirit blazed like a star that refused to die. And she knew, though she dared not say it aloud, that she was drawn to that fire more than to any crown. On the eve of a grand feast, Lira found herself summoned to stand before the king. He boasted of his victories, of the empire that bent before him. His words were sharp, his pride unshakable. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, she felt nothing but cold. The hall erupted in cheers, but her heart screamed silently for escape. That night, unable to endure any longer, she returned once again to the dungeons. The guards were fewer, drunk from the feast above. She slipped into the shadows until she reached Evan's cell. He stood as she approached, his chains rattling softly in the silence. "You should not keep coming here," he said, though his voice carried no anger. "And yet I must," she whispered. Her hands tightened around the bars. "I cannot breathe in this palace. Every step I take is not mine. Every word I speak belongs to someone else. But when I speak to you, I feel alive." For a long moment, neither moved. The torches flickered, shadows dancing on the walls. Finally, Evan stepped closer, his face inches from hers, though iron separated them. His voice was quiet but strong. "Then don't give yourself to them. Choose your own path." Tears pricked her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. "I was promised to a king before I even had a voice. How can I break the chains that bind me?" Evan's gaze did not falter. "Chains are only strong until you stop believing in them. Once you see them for what they are, they cannot hold you." The words sank deep into her soul. For the first time, she realized her greatest prison was not the palace walls. It was the belief that she had no choice. Slowly, she reached through the bars, her fingers brushing against his chained hand. The contact was brief, but it was enough. A spark leapt between them, silent yet undeniable. She pulled back, her breath unsteady. "If I were to defy them, if I were to choose my own path, there would be war." "There already is," Evan replied, his voice low but steady. "But there is also hope. And sometimes, hope begins with one person willing to stand." Her heart raced as she turned away, afraid the guards might hear. But before she left, she looked back one last time. His eyes burned with the same fire she had seen since the beginning, and in that fire she found the courage she had long believed lost. When she returned to her chambers, the palace roared with music and laughter, but to Lira the sound felt hollow. She sat by her window staring at the stars. For the first time in her life, she imagined a future not chosen for her, but one she might seize for herself. And though fear still gripped her, the thought of Evan's hand against hers made her believe it was possible. The preparations for Lyra's binding ceremony filled the palace with noise and splendor. Musicians rehearsed in the grand halls, priests polished sacred relics, and seamstresses worked through the night on gowns made of rare silks. To the empire, this was the union that would seal their dominance for generations. To Lira, it felt like the tightening of chains she could no longer endure. Everywhere she walked, she saw eyes watching her, Lords eager for the power her marriage would secure, servants whispering about the future queen, guards standing taller at the thought of serving under a king feared across the galaxy. Yet none of them saw her as she truly was, a young woman suffocating beneath a destiny she did not choose. That night, unable to bear the weight of silence, she returned again to the dungeons. Evan rose as she approached, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. His eyes softened at the sight of her, and though chains still bound his wrists, he carried himself as though he were freer than anyone above them. "You look tired," he said gently. "I am," she admitted. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands to the cold bars. "Every day they dress me in jewels. Every day they tell me how glorious my future will be. But I feel as though I am walking toward my own grave." Evan's jaw tightened and his voice dropped low. "Then don't walk. Stop. Turn. Do what they least expect." Her heart pounded at the thought, though fear gripped her throat. "If I do, they will kill me." "They might," Evan admitted, his gaze steady on hers. "But if you do not, you'll already be dead inside. Is that the life you want?" The words hit her harder than any blow. She had never heard anyone speak so plainly, never heard truth stripped of all ceremony and lies. For a long moment she stared at him, her hands trembling against the iron. "I don't know how," she whispered. "You don't have to know everything now," he replied. "You only need to decide that your life belongs to you, not to them. Once you choose, the path will reveal itself." Lira swallowed hard. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine defiance, not as a dream but as a choice. She imagined standing before the king and saying no. She imagined walking away from the crown, from the throne, from everything her people demanded. And though terror filled her chest, so too did a strange and dangerous freedom. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Lira pulled back quickly, her hood falling over her face. A pair of guards passed by, half drunk and laughing, paying little attention. But as they faded into the distance, Evan leaned close to the bars and whispered, "The day of your binding, if you wish it, I can help you escape." Her eyes widened. "How?" His faint smile returned, though his voice remained steady. "Humans are not as helpless as your people believe. You only need to decide if you are ready to leave." She stepped back, her heart racing. She wanted to demand answers, to know how such a thing could be possible, but fear gripped her tongue. Still, she could not ignore the spark that had already been lit. As she returned to her chambers that night, the palace towers glittered above her, and the songs of her people echoed in celebration of the union to come. Yet in her chest a new rhythm beat louder than the music, stronger than the voices of her lords. It was the rhythm of choice. And though she did not yet speak it aloud, Lira knew that when the day came she could not give herself to the king. Something greater had already claimed her heart. The day of the binding ceremony drew near, and the palace became a hive of feverish preparation. Priests blessed golden chalices, musicians tuned their instruments, and banners bearing the king's crest were hung across every wall. To the Zarin people, it was to be a day of triumph, proof that their empire was unshakable. To Lira, it was the day she would lose herself forever. Unless she acted, her nights were restless, her days suffocating. Every moment she wore the heavy gowns meant for the ceremony, she felt as though she were being wrapped in chains. Yet each time her heart faltered, she remembered Evan's voice, low and steady in the dark dungeon. "If you do not choose, you will already be dead inside." 2 nights before the ceremony, Lira risked everything by returning to the dungeons. She wore a simple cloak, her hood pulled low, her footsteps muffled against the stone. When she reached Evan's cell, his eyes found her immediately, burning with the same unbroken fire. "It is almost time," he said, his voice calm despite the chains around his wrists. Her throat tightened. "I am terrified." "Good," he replied. "Fear means you still care. Courage is not the absence of fear, Lira. It's moving forward in spite of it." She pressed her hand against the bars, her voice trembling. "Tell me how. Tell me what to do." Evan leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "On the day of the ceremony, the palace will be full of noise, full of distraction. My people always plan for such moments. There will be a strike, not to conquer, but to rescue those taken. If you wish to be free, you must reach me before they move me deeper into the palace." Her heart pounded. "You knew this all along?" He gave the faintest smile, though pain lingered in his bruised face. "We always hope for rescue. But you, Princess, you are not the one who needs saving. You are the one who must decide to walk out of your cage." The weight of his words pressed on her chest. All her life she had been told what she was, where she belonged, whom she would serve. But now, standing in the silence of the dungeon, she realized that every chain she bore could be broken by a single choice. "Why do you risk so much?" she asked softly. "Why even speak to me this way?" His answer was quiet, almost a whisper. "Because I see who you are. Not the jewel they parade, not the prize they trade. I see the woman who looks at the stars and wonders if her life could be more. And that woman deserves freedom." Her breath caught, and she pulled back quickly, afraid of what her heart might betray. She turned to leave, but before she did, she whispered, "If I come to you on that day, I will not turn back." Evan's voice followed her into the shadows. "Then neither will I." When Lira returned to her chambers, the palace above her blazed with celebration, but she no longer heard the music or the laughter. In her mind, she heard only the steady beat of her own heart, louder now than her fear. The day of her binding approached, and for the first time in her life, Lira knew that her destiny was not set in stone. It waited for her choice. And when the moment came, she would not walk toward the crown. She would walk toward freedom, no matter the cost. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the palace shone brighter than ever before. Towers blazed with banners, streets overflowed with cheering crowds, and the air was thick with the sound of drums and horns. To the Empire, this was the day their princess would seal the power of their rule. To Lira, it felt like walking to her execution. Her attendants dressed her in layers of shimmering silk, each piece heavier than the last, until she felt crushed beneath the weight. Jewels glittered on her neck and wrists, a crown rested on her brow, but none of it felt like hers. With every touch, every word of praise from the servants, her heart sank deeper. The closer the hour drew, the more she could hear Evan's words, burning inside her. "Chains are only strong until you stop believing in them." The grand hall was vast and crowded, lit by thousands of torches and jeweled chandeliers. Lords and nobles filled the balconies, chanting praises to the king. Warriors lined the aisles, their armor gleaming as they beat their fists against their chests. At the far end stood the king himself, his eyes cold and sharp, his pride towering above the gathered court. Lira walked slowly down the aisle, her steps steady but her breath tight. Every gaze was upon her, every voice echoing her name, yet she felt utterly alone. The priests spoke, their words booming through the chamber, but she barely heard them. Her mind raced with the memory of Evan, of the fire in his eyes, of the promise he had whispered. "If you wish to be free, you must reach me." As the vows were spoken, Lyra's heart thundered. She glanced to the side, and for a split second, she saw movement in the shadows near the lower doors, figures slipping inside where no one else was watching. Her breath caught. The strike Evan had spoken of. It was happening. The priests turned to her, raising their hands, demanding her vow of obedience to the king. The hall fell silent, waiting for her voice. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she looked toward the crowd, and though she could not see Evan, she felt his presence, like a steady flame guiding her. The silence stretched, the lords shifting uneasily, the king's eyes narrowing with suspicion. Then from the far end of the hall the sound of steel rang out. A shout echoed, followed by chaos. Human soldiers, ragged but fierce, burst into the chamber, striking down guards as they charged. The crowd erupted into panic. Nobles screamed, warriors drew their weapons, and the king roared in fury. Lyra's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. This was the moment. Her chains were either to be broken or forever locked. She turned from the king, her voice rising not in a vow of obedience but in a cry of defiance. "I will not bind myself to you." Gasps filled the hall. The king's face twisted in rage, his hand reaching for his blade. But before he could act, a figure broke free of the chaos, fighting his way through the storm of blades and bodies. Shackled, wounded but unbroken, Evan pushed forward, his eyes locked on her. Their gazes met across the chaos. And in that single glance, Lira knew the choice was made. She would not belong to a crown, nor to a king. She would belong only to herself, and to the freedom that burned in the eyes of a human who refused to kneel. As the hall descended into battle, Lira lifted her voice once more, louder than the screams, stronger than the fear. "I choose my own fate." And with those words, everything changed. The great hall had become a battlefield. The clash of steel rang against the marble walls, the cries of soldiers and nobles alike echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Smoke from shattered torches filled the air, casting long shadows that twisted across the chaos. Lira stood frozen for a heartbeat as the world around her dissolved into violence. The king roared orders, his voice carrying above the din. His guards surged forward, cutting down the human fighters who had stormed the hall. Yet for every human that fell, another rose, their defiance burning brighter than the Empire's might. Through the chaos, Evan fought like a man possessed. Still bound by chains, he drove his captors back with sheer will, his eyes locked on Lira as though she were the only star in a sky filled with fire. She moved toward him, her heavy ceremonial gown, slowing her steps, but her determination stronger than fear. The king saw it. His rage boiled over, his eyes blazing with fury as he raised his blade. "She is mine," he roared, charging through the crowd like a storm. Before he could reach her, Evan broke through the last of the guards. His wrists were bloodied from the chains, his breath ragged but his spirit unbroken. Lira reached him just as another guard lunged forward. Without hesitation, Evan threw himself between her and the blade, catching the strike across his shoulder. Pain twisted his face, but he did not falter. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but unyielding. She pulled at his chains, desperation flooding her chest. "I won't leave you." The hall erupted further as explosions shook the palace. The human strike team had breached deeper, scattering soldiers and drawing the king's wrath. Amid the chaos, one of the human fighters tossed Evan a blade. With a roar, he cut through the shackles binding his wrists, the chains clattering to the floor. For the first time since his capture, Evan stood free. He grasped Lira's hand, his grip firm, his eyes blazing. "We run together." They moved, through the chaos, weaving between fighters and overturned tables. Guards tried to block their path, but Evan cut them down with the fury of a man who had fought too long in chains. Lira, untrained in battle but guided by desperation, pulled a fallen spear from the ground and struck out when enemies came close. For the first time in her life, she was not a jewel to be displayed. She was fighting for her own freedom. Behind them, the king's roar shook the hall. "Seize them! Bring me the traitor alive!" His fury was greater than any blade, his steps thunderous as he cut through humans and guards alike to pursue them. Lira and Evan broke into the palace corridors, their footsteps echoing as they fled toward the outer halls. The sounds of battle raged behind them, but the path ahead was no less dangerous. Alarms blared, doors slammed, and soldiers poured from every corridor to block their way. At one turn, they were nearly surrounded. Lira pressed her back to the wall, her chest heaving, fear clawing at her throat. But Evan stood firm, his blade raised, his eyes burning. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady even as exhaustion weighed on him. But then, to her own surprise, she shook her head. "No, we fight together." For a moment their eyes met in the flickering torchlight, and in that silent exchange, they became something more than princess and prisoner. They became allies bound not by duty but by choice. With a cry that echoed through the palace, they struck forward. Evan's blade carved a path, and Lira's spear thrust beside him, her strikes clumsy but driven by desperation and fire, Step by step they carved their way through the enemy ranks, their hands never breaking apart. As they neared the outer gates, the palace shook once more from the human assault outside. Freedom was close, but so was the king, his wrath closing, in behind them like a storm. Lira knew the final choice was yet to come, and when it did, her life, and Evan's, would never be the same. The night sky burned with fire as the palace trembled from the battle raging inside and out. Alarms howled through the towers. Soldiers clashed in the courtyards, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Yet for Lira and Evan, the world narrowed to one desperate path. The gate ahead, the final barrier between captivity and freedom. They burst into the outer courtyard, breathless and bloodied. Human fighters were locked in combat with Zairan soldiers, their blades sparking beneath the torchlight. The air smelled of smoke and iron, the ground littered with shattered stone. Evan gripped Lira's hand tightly, pulling her through the chaos, his blade flashing as he cut down those who barred their way. But then, a shadow fell over them. The king himself strode into the courtyard, towering and furious, his armor dark as obsidian, his eyes burning with rage. His voice thundered across the battlefield. "Traitor, you dare defy me?" His soldiers fell back, giving him space as he drew his great blade. The ground shook with his steps as he advanced. Lira froze, her chest heaving. The weight of his power was suffocating, his fury a storm that threatened to swallow her whole. But Evan stepped forward, his body still marked with wounds, his breath ragged. He raised his sword, standing between the king and Lira. "She belongs to no crown, not yours, not anyone's." The king laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "You are nothing but a human, weak, broken, unworthy of even standing before me." Evan's grip tightened on his weapon, his voice steady. "Then strike, and see if your empire is strong enough to crush the will of one man." The duel began, with a crash of steel. The king's blows were like thunder, each strike powerful enough to shatter stone. Evan staggered beneath the force, barely holding his ground, but he did not falter. Every time he was knocked back, he rose again, his eyes burning with the fire Lira had seen from the very beginning. Lira stood frozen, her heart pounding as she watched. The king was too strong, his fury too great. Evan could not defeat him alone, and in that moment she understood the truth. Freedom was not given, it was claimed, together. Grabbing a fallen spear, she rushed to Evan's side. The king roared, in outrage as she joined the fight, her strikes clumsy but fierce. Side by side, human and princess fought against the empire's might. For every strike of the king's blade, they answered with defiance. For every step he advanced, they pushed, back with their will. The king raised his sword for a final crushing blow. Evan, his strength nearly spent, met it with all that remained in him. The clash shook the courtyard, steel screaming against steel. At that moment, Lira struck with her spear, driving it beneath the king's guard. The blade pierced deep. The king's roar shook the sky as he staggered, his power faltering. Evan seized the moment, driving his sword into the tyrant's chest. With one last cry, the king fell, his shadow collapsing into the dust. Silence swept across the courtyard. The soldiers froze, their king lying broken before them. Slowly, one by one, the humans pressed forward, their banners rising above the chaos. The Zairan guards lowered their weapons, their will shattered. Evan fell to one knee, his breath ragged, blood staining his side. Lira rushed to him, her hands trembling as she lifted his face. His eyes met hers, and though exhaustion weighed heavy, his fire still burned. "You are free now," he whispered. Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled through them. "No, we are free." As dawn broke over the burning palace, Lira stood, beside Evan, no longer a jewel to be bartered, no longer a prize promised to a king. She was a woman who had chosen her own path, and in that choice, she had found love, freedom, and a new beginning. The empire trembled that day, not because of armies or crowns, but because one princess dared to give herself not to power but to humanity, and the galaxy would never forget it.